Alrighty. Welcome to the Squeaky Wheel.
Squeaky wheel.
We're gonna go through a little bit of the behind the scenes of WheelWOD. So the evolution of WheelWOD and the logistics behind some of the systems that we have in place, that we have gotten some questions about. And I think it's just important to tell it like it is, and transparency and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, WheelWOD has evolved like crazy, immensely, if you will, over the last 10 years.
It's a big word.
Yep. In 2015, you had the first ever adaptive crossing style competition at Wadapalooza. I think there was like 10 to 13 athletes. You're all in the same division, so like lowers, community gets seated, community gets Neros. It was all one division. It was more of a showcase, the competition. And then you fast forward 10 years to 2024 games, going into 2025 season. We now have 16 divisions that are split up based on data we've collected, the effects on power output on impairments, different levels of need for these categories based on registrations and how you have each category. So like that's a huge step in 10 years for any sport.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was competing. So I got sick in 2017, and I can talk a little bit about my story later. But when I started competing, we met at the 2018 WheelWOD Games in Canada, and I was competing again. My division was standing feeding. I'm a neuro athlete, and we were all in the same category competing against each other. And I think that was a very important step, because now being on the back end of things, I've seen the data collected by UN Study from those like transition times and power output and even fatigue a little bit, like all of this data collection showing inconsistencies between impairments that dictate, hey, this needs to be its own category.
I guess a good way to say it is like when we start to think about splitting categories or even like in classification where to put athletes, there has to be an insurmountable or untreatable impairment that affects the power output that makes it unfair or unlikely, I won't say impossible, but unlikely for it to be surpassed through training. So like if we take the seated division as a great example of this, so our upper and lower divisions, but with seated, we split it between seated with hip and seated without hip. And that's a huge distinction. Even with that seated without hip, we have seated with high, where we have a lot of app function. We don't have enough athletes to split those three categories yet, but we do for seated with hip and seated without hip. And so when you have someone who has any form of hip function, any control of the hip,
which, from a biomechanic mind, hip function is a broad terminology that effectively is geared toward a specific segment of anatomy. So when somebody says hip function, I think people automatically go to, well, they can either stand or they can't. That's not the case.
No, and that's not where, especially in the seated division, that's not always where the greatest difference in the capacity to do power lies. But when you have someone who has any kind of contractile control of the muscles around their hip flexors, quads, hamstrings, glutes, it creates a distinct and insurmountable advantage to someone who doesn't have that. Like, I don't have any hip function. I can't fire anything below like 2 inches below the belly button. And so when you have someone that can do that with like hip, butt, hamstring, quad, it's not just the contractile power. It's the balance. It's the proprioception. It's even if you don't have
awareness.
Yeah, awareness. Even if you don't have the ability to stand up on your own, if you have the capacity to flex a glute, flex a quad, and use that to take some weight or some pressure off your arms at any particular movement, that's hip function. That's insurmountable. That's something that like gives you a distinct advantage. It's someone who doesn't have the capacity to even if they're not driving, to lock out and create stability.
Now, the common misconception is that the rule book dictates classification. I want us to talk about the differences between our rulebook eligibility and actually what our classification system is.
Yeah, and I think this is where people get confused. If you have a certain diagnosis, it can make you eligible for that division.
There is a list of eligibility criteria in our rulebook, which can be found at www.wheelwod.com/rules.
However, a diagnosis is not the same thing as impairment or a limitation, is a better way of saying it, because you could have a diagnosis, but looking for, we're not like the Paralympics where we have a single modality sport. You know, like fencing or swimming or basketball or like USA powerlifting, there's only certain things, only certain moves they're ever going to do, and that's the only things they have to take into account. We are in the sport of power output. Power output is king within our sport, and so we have to take it any form or anything that directly affects power output within our classification system. So while you may have the diagnosis, we would use you for an example, stroke, vestibular ataxia, probably had dysfunction in the right side of your body. There's probably some nerve dysfunction in your hand. If you drop things randomly, sometimes your hands don't work as well. Like sometimes your right leg doesn't work as well. And whereas that is diagnosable, when you train consistently, you can out-train the diagnosis to where it does not, when we're watching you, affect your ability to produce power through movements. And I think that's the distinction people need to understand. It's not just the diagnosis. You know, MS is a great example. We have MS athletes in stated diagnosis. We have them in minor, we have them in moderate, we have them in major, across the board in all there are categories. Because it's not the diagnosis of MS that puts you in a category. It's the MS's effect.
It's the presentation of symptoms.
Thank you. It's the presentation of symptoms, how they affect power output, and if they affect power output to a certain level.
Can speak with personal experience that when I am out of shape, when I have not been training, when I've not had the time to work out, my neurologic deficits are great. When I train, I overcome a lot of that. So my hand works a little bit better because I train proprioception. I have my VOR exercises and I have a little bit better body awareness and control because of training. Now, my diagnosis isn't going to change. A lot of my deficits won't ever change. You know, my vestibular system on the right side is dead, but I can compensate to a point where those symptoms aren't presentable. And a lot of people don't know I'm an adaptive athlete because of the intentionality of my training.
With that training, with that conversation, you know, we told you can't, well, maybe you should try anyway. Stadi's a good example of this. Like they told Stadi he'd never do a sit-up. He spent I think it was like 2 or 3 years trying to figure out how to do a sit-up, and now he does it all the time.
Stadi's a T4. His dad is very high.
Yeah. And so like they told me he'd never do it. He figured out a way to do it, and now he can do it all the time. And so there's a level of compensation when someone tells you that, hey, you can't do this. Well, has someone actually tried this? Someone actually tried for more than 2 or 3 tries.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot in the sport, but when we get into like your goal for the aero division should not be to decompensate into a more impaired division.
Yeah.
Your goal should be to actually train to a point where you go on to the less impaired division. And I talk about this all the time when we're ready for like level 1s or going through CrossFit. We talk about our fitness being defined as like the area of the curve. So if we have 2 axes, one being like high power output, short duration efforts.
Fran.
Yeah, Fran, one max deadlift. We have it on this axis. Like how long does it take you to do it? On this axis, we're talking like more aerobic capacity stuff, so like longer duration stuff.
Okay.
Our goal within CrossFit is to have the greatest area under the curve. And it goes through training things that are hard, as you're not good at, training your weaknesses, as people like to say. Our goal within CrossFit, it should be for everyone, even if you're not competing, is to incrementally increase that area of the curve, create a bigger area under the curve for as long as you humanly can. So that way, when you're 20, your area of the curve may be, this level. At 30, your area of the curve is higher. At 40, it may be the same or maybe a little bit higher. So then when you get to 50, your area of the curve is back to where you were at 20. And so like I'm fitter now. I have a greater area under the curve now at almost 40 than I did when I was 31 or 32. I would even say 35. So my area under the curve is increased. And that comes with treating things that may be hard and we never progress into like what would be considered equal value for X, but still trying to train those things. So we talk about the neurodivisions. The reason why some neuro athletes will bounce or change categories every couple of years is because they either, had a relapse or a decompensation of their impairment and it's affecting their power output rate.
Yeah.
Or they've gotten better and they've trained through those things and they've decreased their limitations, and so now they're in a less impaired category.
So I think that the beautiful part about the classification system, which is different than the eligibility criteria, so what gets you in the game versus what category you're in, our classification system is points-based, loosely based off the Paralympic classification system, which you and Stouty had both been through. And also, in multiple sports. And so you can speak personally to the ins and outs of, okay, for bench press, for powerlifting, they are focusing on these muscle groups, this specific range of motion. And that's all they're focusing on. And so the points that are assigned to you based on that specific criteria is pretty straightforward. When we get to CrossFit, we have to take into consideration power output across multiple nodal domains and multiple degrees of freedom. So let's take a sumo deadlift high. If I am doing a sumo deadlift high pull, my power output could be X. But if I cut off an ankle, that's going to be X minus A. Yeah. Then if I chop off below the knee, that's going to be X minus ankle plus knee. Like it incrementally increases the power output deficit, and those degrees of freedom aren't necessarily joint or muscle group. It's also the 10 general physical skills. So balance, coordination, agility, accuracy.
Respiratory endurance.
Yeah, I was totally going to continue and enlist all of them off. You might give me to it. So it creates a different puzzle in order to take an athlete with X diagnosis, but it presents in these different forms, and how does that change their power output? Well,
I think the other thing is that the classification system that we have to have has to be ever evolving, because the data we have coming in is never evolving. So when we first started this, we didn't have enough data to show a real big difference between seated with it and seated without it. Then we started collecting things like max lifts. We started collecting, benchmark workout times from the best athletes. We started collecting, the skier bikes and rowers are great because we can start collecting direct data on the effects of power output based on time, split time, strokes per minute. We can collect all that data and start to show those insurmountable differences from what's utilized. Like we know that, we've redone this math and it stayed pretty much the same for a long time. Is that like if you're lifting with 2 points of contact, it's that upper extremity athlete, your lift is going to be somewhere around 23 to 26 percent less if you're lifting with a one way of contact. So we look at the max lift that way. We also know like on echo bikes, if you have upper extremity impairment 1.2 point, there's not a huge difference. It may be 2 to 3%.
Right.
But if you have an AK versus a BK, there is a massive difference, probably somewhere between 15 to 25% in power output that you can produce on an echo bike. If you have even a BK to an AK, and you check within they're like lower rider where you have.
Yeah, we don't want to bore the audience.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you and Saudi have done a beautiful job, collecting this objective measurement. And the objective point system that we have is important. But I also want to touch on the subjective piece, which I think every classification has to have, because every impairment is different, every presentation is different, every situation is different. And so in order to create an even playing field of competition, we have to divide like with like.
Yeah, and so I think where people get confused because we'll get questions along the lines of like, well, I have nerve dysfunction in my left leg that decreases power output. And it's like, okay, yeah, you may have been diagnosed with that, but you also just squatted 400 pounds.
Right.
So it's obviously not affecting power output to a certain extent.
Right.
I don't say that everything needs to be seen.
No, there are impairments that are invisible.
Yeah, but when a diagnosis is presented, but there's no effects that can be measured,
right,
or measured or visible, I would say, that's something we take into account when we're talking about classification. If you have a diagnosis, but it cannot be measured, but you can go to a doctor, with doctors for something wrong. Well, it can't be measured by a doctor by like nerve conduction studies, muscle testing, things like that, and it also cannot be visible. That's something we can't give credit for just because you have the diagnosis.
Right.
And the other hard part for us that we have to distinguish is like, we're a worldwide company. We had 33 different countries at the Deaf CrossFit Games last year. Not every country utilizes the same testing. And so we can't require or mandate these tests alone on what we take, because that skews the sample. So say
some people don't have access to it.
They don't have access to it, but say we require a test that is popular in the United States, but it's not popular, say, in the UK. So the doctors we have here in the United States know how to perform that test properly because they do it all the time. They practice it. They've gotten good at it. But say this doctor in the UK is doing it for the first time, they may not know how to measure it properly, so we get skewed samples.
Well, it's not even a matter of properly, because anybody can learn how to do it correctly. It's there's a subjective bias to any clinician performing a test. And then also there's specificity and sensitivity of each individual test. So those compounding factors make it to a point where there's absolutely no black and white. And every case is different. Every individual is different. And we had a lot of interesting classifications this year where at this point in time, we didn't really have a good category for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because we have yet to evolve. There's still room to grow.
And there's only a few of us we can't create a branded category for 2 or 3.
Right.
What I'd love to do is, again, let's grow the sport. Let's have, in the next 10 years, let's have another 14 divisions. Let's have 30 divisions. Or week-long festival of nothing but cripples around. Great. But then we can split vision. We can split vision into B1, B2, B3. We don't have to worry about
short stature.
Short stature would be great to grow that to a point where low, mid, and high. All these would be great to split to. We have to have the resources, the numbers in order to do it. We only get resources when we have the numbers to do it.
And we are only 2 people. And WheelWOD is only a small group of people who care very, very deeply. But if anybody wants to help, if anybody wants to step up and, take on part of this mantle, I love teaching. We love what we do. But it's exhausting. No offense, we do all.
It's a lot of work, but it's work worth doing, and it's work that when you get to meet these athletes and talk to them, there's not even a second thought about when you can see even living.
Yeah, I would agree. I think virtually it's harder because people don't realize that they're emailing an actual human, and so some of them are standing out so nice, but I completely understand. You were not a very nice person when you competed.
I was not.
So,
I was nice to the judges.
good. Always be nice to your judge.
It's kind of a little bit of it's like watching warfare type of guy.
To the other athletes?
Oh, yeah. Hey, better not trip on that jump rope like I saw you do a few seconds ago while we're out there.
Oh.
Isn't this like 10 pounds under your max? You sure you're going to be able to do it for 10?
Oh.
Just little
jabs. Just undermine their confidence.
See, sowing those seeds of doubt.
You know, I'm really glad you don't do the big.
Yeah, I don't do that in the
You're big off soft.
Yeah, Julie ain't soft, and that's what I get told. AT is soft. So no words to describe.
Fragile.
Internally, yes.
Actually, yeah, and you're like a M&M.
Hard on the outside, super soft and melty on the inside.
Yeah, give you some gluten and you're out.
Grilled GTO with steak.
Milk by stick. Yeah, I just never know how to sign out. Like the ending of the first show is.
We appreciate you guys coming to watch us here at the Squeaky Wheel. We hope these are enjoyable and informative for all you viewers out there. We will see you next time.
You looked at the wrong camera.
No purpose.
Just always keep them guessing, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Everything you do is on purpose.
Except for shooting with his.
Yeah, but that's gluten's fault.